As I walked out, I walked straight into Putin coming in the door, with his party. I must have been a few feet away from him. And the same thing happened 2 years later. Looking back, what would that young man on Riddings have thought? What was I capable of? I think my biggest achievement, I'll repeat what I said before, was not necessarily achieving, but getting into a situation where I potentially was going to do something of great significance. My name's Brian Leonard, service number M4284392. I was a sergeant when I left the Air Force, and I served from May 1966 to May 1978, 12 years in total. I was brought up on Riddings Road. I lived there until I was 11. But it was the background. I was what was known in those days as illegitimate. I didn't have a father. My mother at the time was a single mother, was also taking care of her younger sister and brother. So there was a fair bit on. That is how we were. We were, you know, we were poor, but so was everyone else. It was a way of life, you know. We had a simple way of living, and it wasn't easy, but we got through it, and you were surrounded by people who were sitting in similar situations. But I think from the very beginning it was always intimated that we wouldn't really make a lot. We wouldn't make a lot of ourselves. I do recall that when I left Deaton County Primary, I took the 11+ examination in the old days, that the headmaster was really, I think, overcome with the success that he'd got in this new school from an area that was supposed to be one of the downtrodden areas. And I know he was genuinely thrilled that a lot of us passed and went on to grammar school. I went on to Huddersfield New College, for example, which was, how can I say it? I was never comfortable at Huddersfield New College. On the very first day, the headmaster said, what we want you to do is to work hard, pass your O-levels, pass your A-levels, and you can go to Oxford or Cambridge. To be quite frank, he'd lost me at working hard. I went for an interview in the last part of my time at Huddersfield New College, and they said, you've got two options, textiles or engineering. And of the two, I took engineering. I became an engineering apprentice. I was an apprentice for 3 years during the swinging 60s. It was a fabulous time. It was all happening around us. I don't think we realised how significant it was, because we were just enjoying it. It's a great time to grow up. But unfortunately, the engineering apprenticeship just wasn't for me. They decided, I was on a 5-year apprenticeship, they decided after coming up to the end of the 3rd year that what I would be doing in the future and what they'd chosen for me wasn't what I wanted to do. At the time I was playing a decent standard of rugby league, nothing major. And I talked to people, and then, I don't know why, just one day I said, I think I'm going to join up. I'm going to become a PTI, physical training instructor. The first person that talked to me, this is things that have happened in my life, by pure coincidence became one of my best friends many years later. But I went in with the idea of being a PTI, and they said to me, but you've got French and Latin O-level. And I said, yeah. Have you thought of being a linguist? I said, I saw that, but I thought that was for officers only. Oh, he said, no, it's you know, would you like to take an aptitude test? So I said, yeah. He said, okay. And he said, you'll go to an RAF camp in the Midlands, do the test, and we'll find out how good you've done. So I went down to RAF North Luffenham. I did the test in a language which I later found out was Mongolian. I then waited a little while. They've said you've got your place if you want to. You can train as a linguist. Company I was working at Halstead. I was a Halstead apprentice, and they said, by the way, you're indentured. You can't just walk away. And the union man was exceptionally helpful to me, and they managed to draw me out of my indentureship simply because I was joining Her Majesty's forces. Had I been going to another job, potentially a competitor, they wouldn't have allowed me. I'd have had to do my full 5 years. Joined up on May 26, 66. We took the oath at Leeds. There were half a dozen of us. Then we went on the train down to Lincoln and got to Lincoln station, thoroughly expecting someone to come out with a truck, shouting and bawling at us. It was very refined. He said, would you get on the bus, please? And we all went on the bus. At that time, they were doing training at two places. One was Swinderby, the other was Hemswell. The first week we'd go to Swinderby. There were 50 in our flight, so it shows how many people were actually joining up in the 60s, an average of 50 a week. When we got to Hemswell, we got off the bus, and I remember the sergeant saying to us, I learned something about the Air Force right from the beginning. He said, you are lucky to get here. He said, if you'd have been at Hemswell, the food's awful. The mess here is great. And I spent the next 12 years, whenever you went on a posting anyway, the first question was asked, what's the mess like? And it was good. I was stationed at Digby, for example, which wasn't the best posting in the world, but had the best mess. It made a huge difference. And then, of course, I went to start on they sent me to the School of Languages, which was at RAF North Luffenham near Stamford. And I did 9 months training there. When I got to the camp, I was hoping that I was going to be chosen as a German student, because I'd done German, although I didn't pass the O level, sorry. I was hoping I'd do that, and when I got there, they said, oh no, you're doing Russian. He said, you could have told straight away, because my job title was ROV L1 being Russian. The Russian course that I did brought out the thing that I wasn't aware of, the thing that changed my life, shall I say. And that was, suddenly, for once in my life, I wasn't at the bottom of the pile. I was at the top. I was the top student on the language side, and when it came to the applied language side, which was basically what we did for the Air Force, using I was top on that as well. And it was the lad from the back streets of Huddersfield that had come to this, and it was the achievement. But I also have to say that I got on very well with the other lads. There were square pegs in round holes, a lot of them. On my course there were 11 of us. One of them was one of the few Jewish airmen. Another one came straight from a children's home, and two of them, the fathers were heroes, genuine heroes in the RAF. But we were a group from all different parts of the country as well, but we got on exceptionally well. And the trade itself, the linguist trade, which I became involved in later on, even after service, is made up of this group of different people, you know, and it was surprising. And certainly when I got my posting, I knew I was going to Germany. I was posted to Berlin, which was the #1 posting for linguists, because of the situation there. You were in Berlin and you were totally surrounded by Soviet forces, so we wanted to know what the Soviet forces were doing, and people like me were instrumental in looking at the military intelligence and passing that on. So, oh, by the way, at the time, everything was highly classified, highly classified. I couldn't even tell, you can't tell relatives, I couldn't tell my wife when I got married later on. Now, look on the internet, it's all there. But, you know, I still find it becomes a way of life. I'm still reluctant to actually say what we actually did. But what we did, put it this way, the Russians knew we were doing it. What they didn't know is how good we were. We were bloody good, you know, and that was, and it was that teamwork. And we had one advantage, it must be said, we had time promotion. In fact, I got accelerated promotion to corporal, which if I'd been in another trade, it would have been dead men's shoes. But no, so I got through, and it made me later on, it made me one of the youngest sergeants in the Air Force. But having said that, I wasn't a great sergeant. I learned by experience, you know. But anyway, we finished the course. We sent out to Berlin. 3 years in Berlin, wonderful place, absolutely wonderful. The West Berliners, as they were there, had this thing about live for today because tomorrow the Soviets could come across. And it was catching and you went with it. And during my time there, I was able to also see acts that I would never dreamed of seeing, because the Americans were very keen on making sure Berlin didn't lack for anything. And one of them, they used to bring their big stars over and they would pay them to perform in Berlin. So I saw Ray Charles, Sammy Davis Jr., Ella Fitzgerald. Wonderful, all cheap tickets, courtesy of the US Air Force, or the US Army, PX. So it was against that background that we were working. Our signals unit was called 26SU, and if you look at the badge, it says underneath immer wachsam, which means always attentive, always alert. I also, when I'd done 3 years on my first as a Russian linguist, I came back and did a German course, and I did German for a year. And then went back out. In that period, when I came back for the training, for the German training, I got married. And we had our first child. She was actually born in Grantham. My daughter came back last year with me and my son. My son was born in Berlin. My daughter she was there from being about 18 months old for 3 years. We went back last September, and we actually went to RAF Gatow. So she actually went back to where she grew up as a youngster. But that was the good time. That was when the RAF was at its best. I had a young family, was doing well. When I'd finished my second tour, in other words, I'd done 6 years at Gatow, they said, what would you like to do? I was a young sergeant. It was intimated that a commission was on the way. What would you like to do? And I became an instructor. For 3 years, I was an instructor at the language school. Unfortunately, I'm not a good instructor. I know that, I learned that very quickly, but they always needed someone in the background to do the paperwork. All the courses had to be rewritten in a specific format. It was a format that the RAF trainers had brought in, and they wanted all the courses to be rewritten in this format, and I did that. So whilst the other more experienced, very helpful, all sergeants and higher were out there doing face-to-face teaching, I was in the back office putting the courses together, and it worked very, very well, so that when I finished the 3 years there, unfortunately coincided with, shall we say, difficulties with my first marriage. Eventually, it was obvious we were going to get divorced. But rather than go back to Berlin, which I could have done, I went to RAF Witten because there was the Branch 51 Squadron, and it was accepted that I was going to become, all being well, a flying linguist. I was going to be flying on, we had the flying linguists, air signallers, on the Nimrod aircraft, which were wonderful. I used to fly with them quite often because they were limited to the number of people that they could, when they were doing practice takeoff and landings, for example, they had to have crew inside, but the crew couldn't be on a normal aircraft, it would be the ground crew, the people who making sure the engines are okay. Because it was highly classified inside, they couldn't come in. So they used us, who had the clearance, and I did a hell of a lot of flying in the Nimrods. And I was just about on the edge of becoming an air signaller. I didn't have to do the course because I'd written it. So I got the biggest shock probably in my life one day when shall I say, my CO, squadron leader, called me in and said, basically, it's up to you, you've got to make a decision, your children or your career. Because I'd said I was going to, in divorce, I intended to take custody of the children. I should say that in the working with me on that unit there in Witten was one guy with 5 children, single parent, but he took exception, and I was given the option either leave the Air Force and have your children, or leave your children and stay in the Air Force. Well, I mean, there was only one answer, of course. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I left the Air Force after 12 years. I got an RAF pension. And that is very important, because an RAF pension is the difference between existing and living nowadays, as it gets on later in life. It allows me to do those little things which I would have difficulty doing without. So the RAF pension is very good. So I then found myself outside, back in Civvy Street again, this time with 2 children. It was difficult, but I'd made the decision, so I decided to try and get the kind of job I wanted. I wanted to work with languages, so I thought, how about trying for export, sales? And I got a job with a firm in Cleckheaton. I worked with them for 3 years. When the round of redundancies came up, I volunteered for it and went to Huddersfield Polytechnic, as it was then, Huddersfield University as it is now. So I did 3 years in textile marketing and ended up with a BA degree. I have to say, since I've had that degree, I've never been asked to show it to anyone. I think it was just the degree, a lot of it was just applied common sense. And I was a mature student. I was 37 when I actually finished the course, and I was with 21-year-olds. Towards the end of the degree, I saw in the newspaper, Huddersfield Examiner, that local company, Sellers, was looking for someone to join their sales team, someone with a knowledge of Russian. I went for the job, and the managing director, who I got to know very well, the late David Armitage, said to me, if I put you in a room with a group of Russians, can you tell me what they're saying? Well, I was highly unlikely to say no. So I said yes. He said, right, okay. That was it, I got the job. The question remains, I got the job 3 months before I finished my course at the Polytechnic. Because I was even willing to finish the course and go straight to work. He said, no, get your degree and come to us. It makes me wonder, did I ever need that degree? It was still the Soviet Union until 1989. So we went out, they were doing a big carpet line finishing in a place called Kishinev, which is now Chisinau in Moldova. So that was part of it. So we went there first. And of course, in those days, you couldn't fly. We couldn't fly direct to Moldova. You had to go into Moscow, change airport, and then fly south from Moscow. So I did get to go onto Red Square for the first time. That was the start of what was to come out to be around 30 years of working with the former Soviet Union markets. So I built up from that. I gave up counting, but I think I'd applied for 100 visas by the time I finished. I used to go there. I was at the point where the stewardesses knew me. On reflection, it's interesting because I never really considered how much the Air Force provided me with. But it did, there's no doubt about it. I quickly fell into the export marketing role, the visiting role, because of routine. The RAF taught me routine. I still work on that principle that if you arrive on time, you're already 5 minutes late. Another thing I think I picked up in the RAF, which again wasn't apparent at the time, it was only later, was empathy. The ability to see things from another person's perspective. Now, there are two golden rules in export marketing. Rule number 1, go to the toilet when you get a chance. And rule number 2, be empathetic in your dealings. Try to put yourself in the buyer's position because you'll do better with it. And that ability to mix in with other people came from the first time you joined up. And routine. And that again, often you don't, as I say, it's on reflection. You don't think about it at the time, you just go with the flow. And that's what I did. And whilst it's working, you try not to question it too much, you know. So I was able to, I got into a job that obviously I could do, I enjoyed doing, and I was successful at it. I found that as a generality, and it's very difficult now because of course I'm looking at things from the 2026 perspective with the war in Ukraine. But I found people basically would react to the way that you approach them. So if you approach someone gentlemanly, nicely, then the chances are that they would react in kind. And I found that I was a bit surprised at the beginning that, you know, the Russians, even under the Soviet Union, were still friendly, and they tried to help me and I would try to help them. But of course, later on, the Soviet Union broke up, and the demand from the central organizations who used to buy from us before, they didn't exist. The one thing that I can always say, I've seen the Pacific Ocean from both sides, from the USA and from the Russian side. I did a lot of work in Siberia. I enjoyed Siberia. Often in Siberia, I would be the first person that someone had come across that they could talk to, because by that time my Russian was fluent. And so I was able to talk to these people, and often they would say, "You're the first Englishman I've ever spoken to." Yeah, and it was nice. Also, at the same time, and I'm not saying this because of the situation, my favourite place to go to was Ukraine. It was wonderful. The food, they used to call it the breadbasket of the Soviet Union because they sold for so much. And it was a wonderful place, especially the food. I went to the Moscow Air Show twice. 2007, when I went there, the president was Medvedev. Because Putin had been president, he became prime minister, then went back to being president. So 2007, it was Medvedev. 2009, it was Putin. Notice I say his name the Russian way. It's not Putin, it's Putin. But sorry, it's a habit. You get used to it. The exhibition would last 10, 11 days. But the first 2 days were official, and the invited guests only. Now we had a stand. I was explaining how you could accurately measure torque with the equipment that we had. So we would go, and I remember on the first time we were opposite the stand for the Cosmos, and they said, by the way, the official party is going to come and look at the Cosmos stand. I said, I'll disappear, because I didn't particularly want to point out, what's this Englishman doing here, that kind of thing. So as I walked out, I walked straight into Putin coming in the door with his party. I must have been a few feet away from him. And the same thing happened 2 years later. Again, I went out my way to escape the official party, only to find that I crossed paths with them. The first thing I should say, by the way, when I saw him first time in 2007 was, one, he was smaller than I expected, but then again that could be to do with the size of the bodyguards he had with him. Secondly, he looked a picture of health, really shining, and that memory stays with me. But as I say, it was a big opportunity for us, the air shows, and we went. I retired at 65 because my wife had asked. She wanted to move back to Huddersfield. We'd moved from Oxfordshire back and stayed. We were back in Huddersfield, back in our hometown, because my second wife, sorry, I should have mentioned years ago, I got married again in 1980. She is a Huddersfield lass as well, or was. So we knew I was leaving, and I was able to, this was well before any problems happened with Ukraine and Crimea, because I think they went into Crimea in 2014, and I'd been to Crimea. I've been right away across Crimea, but all this happened after I'd retired, and I was able to say goodbye to everyone with a final farewell party in St. Petersburg rather than Moscow. But yeah, I left the company. I was happy. Looking back, what would that young man on Riddings have thought? What was I capable of? I think my biggest achievement was not necessarily achieving, but getting into a situation where I potentially was going to do something of great significance, be it get a job with an international association, get a huge amount of money for doing a contract, or even flying with the flyboys. Okay, it didn't happen, but that young man from Deaton wouldn't have even thought of joining the Air Force. And it's interesting that I have to say, I have 3 close friends I think of at the moment, all of which I would have said exactly the same, all from humble circumstances, all who would say, I won't join the forces. They did. 2 of them were majors when they retired. Unfortunately, the other one was killed in Northern Ireland. But it's that accelerant that brings it all about, and also, I suppose in a way, the lad from Huddersfield had to get away from Huddersfield, to come back to Huddersfield to see it. There was never any question. I mean, my late wife always said we're going back to Huddersfield, but I was never disagreeing. It's where I'm comfortable, it's where I'm from. Can't underestimate the significance of my time in the Royal Air Force. Everything that I've achieved, or nearly achieved, is courtesy of the Royal Air Force in one way or another. And if I had to do it again, would I do it again? Of course.